Hello, this is Canonical, the podcast that takes literature out of the classroom. I'm James Shao, and I am talking with my co-hosts, Iad, Darius, and Sam Spieler today.
Hello.
Hey.
Today we are reviewing Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders. This is the first book in our series, Alternate Histories, Alternate Realities. We will have 2 more episodes about Lincoln in the Bardo where we will have a more in-depth discussion in the next couple of weeks. If you would like to find us online, we are on social media at Canonical Pod and on Reddit at rCanonicalPod. So since this is the first book of our series, I'd like to ask Iad, why did you want to do this series on alternate history, alternate reality?
I think for me, the purest attraction to this genre of novels is seeing kind of how history cascades. And for me, I think these novels work the best when we start from one specific change and then we watch how the effects of that change ripple outwards. Now, that said, while I really like this book, I think this book is going to test the limits of that description. I don't know if it's really a good pick that Sam has made for the series.
Yeah, I don't disagree.
I actually think this topic is really interesting, partly because generally I'm into sci-fi, but also this idea of like multiverses is especially popular in pop culture now. And I know, Iad, that this actually would make it less interesting for you, but I think it is quite interesting in that we see this formerly obscure scientific philosophical idea of like alternate realities, and now it's very mainstream. Like Marvel has a whole franchise based on alternate realities and multiverses, and it's just really, really in the public space now. I mean, to the point where an alternate history is almost accepted. People wouldn't think twice about reading a book or watching a movie about that or a TV show about that.
I mean, it's a meme now where people joke about we are living in the worst timeline.
Yeah, but, it shares space with science fiction because it is speculative. But the connection between the two, I think, is really tenuous because I think that with alternate history, it's really about history and how history works. That's the central thing. With science fiction, I think it's much more about science and technology.
Yeah. So, Sam, you did pick this book. Why did you want to read Lincoln in the Bardo?
Well, James, you and I think we were introduced to Saunders' work in Lucy Corrin's class at UC Davis when we read his short story, Sea Oak. So it's a good story, and it really made me want to read more of his work. I've read about half of his work at this point, 2 of his 4 short story collections and 1 novella. And I remember struggling with the novella in ways that I never have with his shorter pieces, but I've still been waiting for a full novel of his. So when this came along, I've been wanting to read it, and I've been trying to shoehorn it into one of our series, and here we go. This is my shoehorning it in.
Well, Sam, maybe your shoehorn was motivated by this rumor I heard, and it's totally a rumor, but didn't Saunders reject you from his MFA program at Syracuse?
Hey, we don't talk about that, except, yes, I
Well,
widely talk about that.
I mean, basically, isn't this your chance to get back at him? Are you going to publicly shame him?
No, you know what? That has nothing to do with how I feel about the book, but you're right. I was rejected.
This is your chance to be the bigger man.
Mm-hmm. No, his work really made me want to go learn under him.
Nice.
Please cut that. This is such a different work from his short stories. I'm sure we're going to talk about that, but it's a unique departure.
So if you had read this, you wouldn't want him to be your teacher?
I wouldn't have been as excited. I'll say that.
Ooh,
really?
Shots fired.
I think it's a good work. It is not what I expected from Saunders.
All right.
I think my expectations might be the problem here.
Well, let's talk about George Saunders. You already touched on the most important part, which is he rejected you personally and professionally.
Right.
But aside from that, the other thing he's best known for is his short stories. His most well-known collections are Civil War Land in Bad Decline, which I really liked, and 10th of December, which I didn't read. His work tends to be satirical and absurdist.
Often about like the problems of capitalism.
He's very much, I would say, kind of like Swamplandia, like Karen Russell Swamplandia that we read a couple years ago. It's a kind of hyperbolic send-up of modern America. I read actually about this book that one thing that troubled him is he spent so much time thinking of 1862 that he was pulled out of his normal voice, which is often usually very contemporary.
This was something I didn't know, but he used to be, I don't know if he was an Ayn Rand fanboy, but he at least subscribed to, what was it, objectivism or something, and then subsequently rejected it, which I thought was interesting. Given his writing, I would have never guessed. So let's talk about Lincoln in the Bardo, his first novel. He published it in 2017 at age 59. And as Sam mentioned, it's quite different, not only in length, but also, I think, in tone. While Lincoln in the Bardo is tragicomic like many of his previous fiction, Saunders makes full use of the novel form. He infuses it with more ideas and complications than in his previous works of short fiction. So my take on this, Sam, as you can tell, is quite positive. I thought it was an improvement on his short stories, though I know you perhaps differ. The novel takes place in December 1862, a month before President Lincoln, issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln's son Willie dies from typhoid, and stricken with grief, Abe visits his tomb at night and holds his son's body, I believe multiple times actually. And this was Saunders's inspiration for the novel.
Yeah, he gave an interview and he said that he was on a vacation with somebody who told him that anecdote. And it might not actually be true, but he was so struck by the image of Abraham Lincoln holding his son's dead body that he stored it away in his mind. He said, I got to do something with that. And, to his credit, he's a good enough writer that he knew a good idea when he came across it, but it's not sort of thing that I would have recognized as an interesting idea at first. So it's interesting to me.
So after his death, Willie enters a purgatory-like limbo state, aka the Bardo, and meets a number of other spirits who refused to move on. These spirits take turns to tell the story, with the majority of the story being told from three main characters, Reverend Thomas, Roger Bevins, and Hans Volman. Saunders also uses text from historical records and fictionalized records to provide context for the story.
I think it's maybe also worth noting that it approaches almost a collage aesthetic. Like you have these different voices telling the story, but it's not like they're taking turns and speaking at length. They often stop mid-sentence and complete each other's sentences. So the boundaries between speakers is often blurred in an interesting way.
Yeah, it's kind of a mix between a choral narrative, where in a choral narrative, people would do that, but they tend to be anonymous because it's a chorus. So it de emphasizes the individual. In this narrative, the individual is emphasized because every passage is signed by the speaker. It's not formatted like in a play where you have like the speaker on the left, and the text on the right, but the speaker comes at the end. So it's weird because it kind of displaces you. You don't know who's speaking until you reach the end of the passage. But it's this kind of amalgam of like this choral narrative and also this kind of drama structure.
And oftentimes they will say things that people won't actually say. Like they'll say things like I said or Bevan said, which are unnatural. So it's not exactly reported speech, but it's not exactly not. I don't know what it is. It's a combination which is, I think, kind of deliberately off.
Yeah, it reads like third person because if you strip away the names, then it's like a third person narrative because they would talk about other people, but every once in a while you also have someone slip in an I. So it's quite strange. It's kind of like an in between, much like the Bardo. And this is all interspersed with documentary text. So, what did you think about this? Did this work for the book? And what did it do for the book?
I found it confusing at first. Once I got used to it, I enjoyed it more, but I don't know if I ever fully loved it. There are moments in the book where I think it's very comical, and those were incidentally some of my favorite moments, but it was a struggle for me at times.
I think the big question here is why? Like, why did he do it? And there are a couple of whys here. Like, why did he intersperse historical text? And I believe at times the text is fictionalized. So it's not always historical text, but always portrayed or displayed as historical text. So that's the first why. And the second why is why have this kind of narration where you have speakers take turns? For me, the historical text aspect of it is interesting because it calls to mind for me this tension between recorded history and oral history. So, especially when it comes to slavery, I think that's a very important aspect of history and in how we view the stories of that time. So that's why I think he does it. I think that's one justification for doing it besides the effect. I think there is kind of like an idea behind that part of structuring the novel.
I think it also contributes to this feeling of, I don't know how to put this, weight, I guess. This kind of collective weight that is on Abraham Lincoln's shoulders at all times. It's especially present in a couple moments in the book, but throughout the book, we have all of these voices, and some of them are either benevolent or passive, but there are people that are not on, let's say, history's side as well. And it kind of creates that full picture of America at that time, I guess.
Let me ask a perhaps very basic question. There are a lot of characters who speak in this novel. Does it feel like there are more characters because it uses this format than it would otherwise? Because my sense is it does feel like there are even more characters because of this.
I will point you to the audiobook version of this that has 166 speakers, 166 different voice actors. So yes, it does feel like there are quite a few.
Right, but does it feel like that because of the narration? Does the narration being divided into all of these different bits of speech enhance that? On a simple level, you do have people's names being called more frequently than you would in other types of narratives, because other narratives, they would just use more pronouns. He said, she said, they said. Here, because the names are always repeated, it's like he's constantly reminding you these are different people.
I will say there are a lot of characters who you do not need to remember, and it is usually clear when that is the case. There are a lot of people who are voicing an opinion, but I don't know if I would call them full characters. They're just background noise. So, in that way, I don't think it makes it feel like there are 166 individual characters that, really flesh out the work. There are only, maybe a dozen that really matter. And even out of those, maybe half of those are central.
So, yeah, you're talking about the effect of this form of narration. I think one thing that's interesting is what this narration kind of mirrors is this ability or occurrence in the novel where multiple spirits can kind of meld and merge and they share a consciousness and share memories. And this way of structuring the form is kind of the same thing because when you have this monologue that's divided into three speakers taking turns, it's kind of like they are sharing this stream of consciousness and delivering the story. So, in that way, there's this kind of parallel that's going on that I think is interesting.
Do you think that it works with the themes of the novel? This is something that kind of bothers me a lot, is that when you look at the form of the novel, it's this very kind of postmodern metafictional thing. But when you look at the themes of the novel, I would say it's not about that at all. It's a very tender human thing. It's not trying to be some sort of wordplay gimmick sort of thing. It's much more about human life. So, does the form and the theme pull against each other in some way?
It doesn't for me because I don't think that one precludes the other. This is actually one of the things that Saunders and also Vonnegut, who Saunders is often compared to, they both do quite well. Vonnegut also would play with narration and play with form, but less drastically. But he, would jump forward and back in time. He would have interlacing narrations and play around with how time works. But Vonnegut, at his core, is a very humanistic writer. He writes about the kind of tragedy of human life, the tragic comic nature of human life, I guess, because it's both. So, in that way, I would say that no, because there are other writers who do this, and I don't think one cancels out the other or anything. It's not like there's an ideal form for writing a certain kind of story that deals with humanity. I think you could have an experimental form in this way that can also deal with real human emotions.
I wouldn't say that it doesn't work. I think it does work, but I guess what I'm trying to figure out is why does it work? Because on the surface of it, at least, it seems like it shouldn't, right? It seems like you have this form that's odd and it takes you out of the story. But then the success of the novel, for me, it depends on forming some sort of empathy, some sort of character identification. So it's like you have this thing that shouldn't work. It seems like these two things are opposed, and yet somehow it does work.
I think he accomplishes it through very careful juxtaposition. A lot of times, for example, when the speakers switch, actually, there's really not much rhyme or reason for them to switch. So even though it kind of takes you out of the text because they are switching, it doesn't take you out of the story because they're telling the same story. They just continue where the other person left off. But what I'm talking about is actually the use of historical text. The historical text, I think, often juxtaposes the feelings that perhaps the public might feel at that moment about President Lincoln compared to his personal tragedy. And because of that juxtaposition, it gives you kind of like a distanced view of a man struggling and suffering. And that heightens his suffering because, for example, there's a section where people criticize him for throwing the party when his son is sick. And you read that and you contrast that with the very real hurt that he's going through after his son has died. And you know that those people who are criticizing him, they don't know the full story. They're just viewing it from afar. And it makes you think about, well, what is the whole story? And you think about how the spirits are able to inhabit his body. And it's a very visceral experience where it's as close as you can get to a person, right? You're literally inhabiting their consciousness. And so he's kind of playing with this distance where, on the ideal level, you have people looking at it from afar and feeling up close and really inhabiting consciousness. But at the same time, he plays with your emotions because you want to say, well, all these historical records are false. Like, he is not this uncaring person who's throwing a party while his son is sick. So I think he's able to get away with that aspect of it through clever juxtaposition. And I think the actual narrators switching back and forth, it really doesn't have much of an effect because, like we talked about before, they're not really switching perspectives. They're telling the same story. They're just taking turns in terms of who's speaking, but the perspective is the same. So you could probably tell from my responses that I actually really did like the book because this kind of hits all of the notes that I want from a book. It makes me feel something. It has a plot, which I am interested in. And it also makes me think. It's this kind of structure where I feel like I can put it together like a puzzle and kind of look at it from different angles, like a 3D puzzle, not like a 2D puzzle, but like a 3D puzzle where you can put things together and look at it from one angle and then kind of rotate it and look at it from a different angle. I don't think I've figured out the book, and I don't think it's a book you can actually figure out, but it is a book that makes you want to think about more.
I think you're right. I think here the most interesting thing we can do is to give Sam the dissenting opinion because Sam is really an outlier here. In the face of all of this critical praise, Sam is the one to stand up and say no. So why no?
I don't think it's even that strong. I don't think it's that bold of a dissent because all the things that you're talking about as a whole, I enjoyed. I think it's really the main issue I had is
He didn't accept you into Syracuse.
that's it. No, it's just that I came in with a maybe too high of an expectation. Um, and I wanted this to be like his short fiction. This is not punchy like his short fiction is. It is clever, but in a different way. It is more mature, which says something more about me, I think, than it does about him, about my expectations. But I was expecting the more juvenile silliness.
So you wanted George Saunders to make you feel like you were 21 again.
I guess so. Yeah.
Well, here's one thing I'll proffer. It's not a satire, and he tends to be very satirical in his short fiction. I mean, I think maybe that's a part of it in terms of expectations, because when I went into the book, I was expecting a satire. Those stories of his that are satirical tend to be the ones I enjoy the most, and it wasn't that. So, I was surprised. It's quite serious. We talked about pathos in the Garlic Ballads. There's pathos here too. It's not what I expected.
Speaking of the garlic ballads, there are also poop jokes and dick jokes and things like that. But those were not funny. It was like I'm not even
It's matter of
saying
fact.
like being a stick in the mud. Yeah, there are comical moments in this, and I would not include those among them.
Like one of the characters walks around with, quote, a huge member.
And there is a point to that too.
So we've talked about a lot of the ideas, or at least in terms of form, we talked about how maybe the form might work in this novel. Of all the ideas that we've talked about, which do you think is most compelling for you as a reader?
That is something I'm really struggling with, and this is something that we'll talk about more in the next episode. But as I see it, the novel is pulling me in two directions simultaneously. And I think Saunders wants to show how these two add up to something more. But I think that the balance is not perfectly struck, because you have the events in the real world and you have the events in the Bardo. And I think that as a reader, you have to choose one or the other as being the main set of stakes that you care about and the main thing that you think is important. And for me, it was really tough to know which one I cared about and which one was less important. But I think for a lot of people, they would say that the main important thing is what happens in the Bardo, because that's on the page. And what happens in the real world is off the page.
So when you say off the page, you mean it's the documentary, the historical text aspect of the book?
What I mean, and I don't want to give away too much as far as spoilers, but the novel hints towards something that we know from actual history will happen later. And it hints for a reason for why that happened later. And I think that a lot of people will be interested in that, but because it's off the page in that it's kind of hinted, and you kind of have to know your history, you have to know your 1860s to get to it, you're not going to get to it as much as you get to what's happening in the Bardo.
I do think that is one of the most significant moments in the book.
Okay, so there's this spoiler theme that we can't really talk about. You should just go read the book, honestly. It's a good read. Even Sam, who says he's disappointed by the book, still likes the book.
I still agree. Yeah, I still agree.
It's just that you're of two minds. There are two spirits inhabiting you. So, I mean, if you had to say, besides this, if I ask you the question, this really basic fifth grade question of what is this book, quote, about? One thing is this thing we can't talk about because it'll spoil the book for you. Is there anything else that you would say that this book is, quote, about?
To me, it reminds me a lot of another book that I read recently, Philip K. Dick's Ubik. And that novel is very similar in that it's about the afterlife and what sort of limits we should have on the connection between this life and the afterlife, and whether an ongoing connection is even desirable. That to me, I think, is a really important human consideration. And because this novel is so willing to tackle that, which is so important in my mind, that's really why I love this novel as much as I do, because it's going for something really big and really important.
I'll read something that is from the printed discussion questions in my copy of the book. So this is from the back of the book. And this says George Saunders has described the question at the core of this book as, quote, how do we continue to love in a world in which the objects of our love are so conditional? When I read that, I was just like, huh? That was not my takeaway from this book. But okay, conditional
Condition.
is the weird part of this.
What?
Like, our love is so. How do we continue to love in a world in which the objects of our love are so conditional?
Instead of conditional, think of transient. I think that's what he means.
So he's described this as the core of the novel. Is he full of shit?
No, I think that his take is exactly what I got out of it. The central thing of the novel is that Lincoln really loves his son. And it's a portrayal of fatherly love that I think is actually pretty uncommon. So it's striking in the sense that it's sincere love for a child, and the child has been taken from him too early. How do you deal with that? Like, that's a very obvious conflict, and it creates obvious tension in the novel. But it's not just his son died, he's sad. There's more to it than that. Like, how do you stop grieving?
One of my favorite juxtapositions here, and I don't think I'm spoiling anything, is the letters from parents who are telling him to stop the war because he's sending their children to die.
Spoiler alert, there was a civil war in the 1860s.
Yeah,
Wah, wah, wah.
man, ruining everything.
Yeah, I think that it's the same thing that you were talking about earlier, James, with this kind of inside-outside. Like, you get the distant view from the outside, but then you see how resonant that is when you get the inside story from Lincoln himself.
Do you think this book has a moral? I would say that this book has a moral center, but do you think it has a moral?
Moral is not the word that I would use because it implies that there's something that you didn't know, and then after reading you do know. I think it's worth noting that Saunders is actually a practicing Buddhist, and in that vein, I would say it's more of a novel as a kind of mindfulness exercise. It's a reminder of something that is obviously true and you know it, but spending, 400 pages thinking about it is worthwhile. That, these things that are important to you will not last forever, and you have to deal with the fact that they will be gone someday. Like, that to me is what I think Saunders would like you to think about. That's what's important to him.
So, to recap, Ian and I both really like this book. I probably would say it's probably the best thing I've read this year in terms of the books we've read. Sam is shocked by that comment. You can't see him on video, but he's shocked. His eyebrows went all the way up.
I'm surprised.
I mean,
Yeah.
this has been a weak year, so
That's true. Yeah.
it's not competing with much. But I'm guessing, even though you liked it, Sam, you didn't like it as much as Ian and I did.
Sounds like not. I did enjoy it, but sounds like, yeah.
Would you recommend it? Would you tell somebody, you got to read this?
Yes.
There's this prejudice among readers that novels are serious and short stories are light. And with Saunders, he waited until he was pretty old before starting novels. So if you were starting with Saunders, is this the place to start?
Ooh.
Ooh.
I don't know. I mean, I think it's a good novel, but again, I came in with high expectations from loving his short stories. So this is a big departure from those. I don't know. I will say, if this is what his novels will be like in the future, if he writes more novels, I would not be disappointed, but it would be a very different Saunders than I'm used to. So I don't know how to answer that question because of that.
I would say yes, this is the place to start. And it's not that I don't like his short fiction, but I think that this is a more complete artistic statement. It's not as funny for sure, but in terms of the lasting impact, I think that this will have more of a lasting impact on me.
It's so different because it really, I think, depends on who you're recommending it to. I think there are people who would absolutely love this novel, and that's their way in to Saunders. There are tons of people who would prefer his short stories. It's just really, really different. The experience of reading his short stories is such a singular positive experience, I'd say. I think I like almost all of his short stories, and I don't say that about many writers. So the New York Times made a virtual reality video of this book. Sorry, an experience, a virtual reality experience, which I experienced fully, and it's on YouTube, so it's free. I thought it was okay. I think, you know, as far as virtual reality goes, I've experienced different kinds of virtual reality videos, and, like in terms of a literary work, I think it's fine. Did you guys have time to watch it, or at least a part of it?
I watched a couple minutes of it. Yeah.
I have not seen it. It seems kind of antithetical to the way I like books.
You mean in
It
written
doesn't
form?
seem to make sense.
Mhm.
VR books, like, what is that? What's the point?
I'd say it's worth looking at just to experience it. I wouldn't say it's a superior experience. It's definitely strange. You know what it is, though? It's like a play. I mean, if someone had dramatized this into a 10-minute play, that's what it would be like.
Okay, so it's a play.
Kind of.
It's a play that you're standing in the center and people walk up to you and start talking at you, and sometimes simultaneously.
Yeah. It's a forced perspective that's different from a play's forced perspective, but essentially it's a play, because in a play, you would never look behind you. Your perspective is from the audience in front, right? In this kind of 3D virtual reality thing, this isn't done in a very sophisticated way, but if you were to do it in a more sophisticated way, you'd be able to interact with different people, and you wouldn't have to follow a track. You would like branch off. I mean, this is not that kind of game. This is much more like a play. So anyway, I watched the whole 10 minutes. I think it's okay. I think it does capture the essence of Bardo in the characters. But, I mean, it's nowhere close to replacing the book. I just thought it was interesting that they decided to make it. I don't know why they decided to make it. I think it coincided with a time when everyone was really hyped about VR, which was like 4 or 5 years ago. The audiobook is also an experience. I didn't listen to it. Sam, you didn't like it.
It was confusing at first. This was one of those where I went back and forth between text and audio, and you do get used to the audio, and it's well done. It's just that the format of the book makes that tough at the beginning. But I think I liked the text more.
I sampled the audiobook and I didn't dislike it, but I looked at the book and I was like, okay, this is a book where the actual text in front of me is important. Hearing it is not the same thing. So I quickly stopped. But the spoiler is for the next episode, there is a movie coming out, possibly, because one of the voice actors, Nick Offerman, bought the rights to this, and he potentially will make a film adaptation. And I think that is an even worse idea than a VR experience.
You know what this reminds me of is what's his name making that Faulkner adaptation?
James Franco. I don't think Nick Offerman and James Franco are in the same category in many ways, but maybe in this way.
Yeah. That's an episode you can find in our archives. We actually watched Franco's version of As I Lay Dying, which I didn't think was as bad as you guys, but I didn't think it was, good. I didn't think it was that bad.
Solid effort. B+.
Good try, Franco. All right. We'll stop here. Thank you for listening. If you disagreed with our book review, you can let us know on Reddit. We are also on social media at Canonical Pod. If you enjoy this podcast, you can give us a nice review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. Next week, we'll be back with more discussion of Lincoln in the Bardo. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you then.